Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
This is the British Broadcasting Corporation.
Fünf, zwei, sieben, eins, sechs, sechs, neun, acht, drei.
Well, who's our first letter from today, Edward?
An old friend of yours, Doris, Brian Hartley of Thornton-le-Field, asking what's being done to build up Anglo-Soviet relations.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
Hello and welcome to episode 19 of Cold War Conversations. Firstly, I would like to thank all those who are supporting the podcast with monthly pledges via Patreon. It is very much appreciated and will allow us to expand the scope of the podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast further and get access to some exclusive extras, then go to our website at coldwarconversations.com and use the Patreon link on the homepage. The Able Archer exercise of 1983 is described as the most dangerous Soviet-American confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Francesca Akhtar has a BN Honours in American Studies with first-class honours from Canterbury Christ Church University in Kent and a master's degree in US History and Politics from the Institute of the Americas, University College London. Her main research interests are US Cold War foreign policy, intelligence history and defence. For her MA in US Studies at University College London, Francesca submitted a thesis in partial fulfilment of the requirements of the degree, which was an analysis of the origins, nature and impact of the Able Archer 83 incident. I am delighted to welcome Francesca Akhtar. Hi Francesca, how are you this evening?
Hello Ian, I'm very well, thank you. It's good to talk to you.
Well, it's very good to talk to you, and thank you very much for coming on Cold War Conversations. Able Archer is one of the subjects that comes up quite often, so I'm looking forward to chatting with you about this.
Yes, I'm looking forward as well.
Great. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, I was born in London. I grew up in the 80s, early part of the 90s. So I don't remember 1983 particularly well. I think I was a little bit young, but I remember quite well the closing stages of the Cold War. I remember the fall of the Berlin Wall very well. I actually remember coming home from school and watching it on Newsround. I don't know if you remember that program.
I do remember Newsround. Was John Craven still around then?
That's right. I can't remember if they had reporters kind of live at the site, but I'm sure I remember that he was fronting the program. That's just something that really sticks out in my mind. But I've always had an interest in the Cold War, particularly on the US side, particularly kind of US history and politics. So I ended up doing an undergraduate degree in American Studies. And then I sort of followed that up with a master's degree where I focused more on the sort of the history and politics of it. I guess my main interest has always been US foreign policy, particularly in the Cold War. And currently I'm studying for a PhD and I'm looking at US defence intelligence during the Cold War.
Great. Well, it sounds like I might have to have you back again. So how did you get interested in Able Archer and the nuclear war scare of 1983?
It was kind of a couple of events that kind of seemed to kind of come together. At the time, I was coming up to write my master's dissertation. As part of my MA degree, we had to write a 15,000-word dissertation. And I knew I wanted it to be on something related to US foreign policy, maybe intelligence. And I'd been looking around for a few ideas. I kind of toyed with a few ideas. It hadn't really come off. And then I remember I was looking at the website of the National Security Archive in the US, which I'm sure you must know of them. But they're fantastic. They are an organization in the US that submit lots of FOIAs from the government to get declassified documents, and they put everything online for free. And so I was thinking, maybe that would give me some ideas. And around that time, they had posted something to do with Able Archer, because the major US report on Able Archer had just been released after, I think, about 10 or 12 years of them trying to get it released. It was finally released, and I thought, oh, this looks really interesting. And I think I'd vaguely heard of Able Archer before, but I didn't really know that much about it. And then also around the same sort of time in the UK, Deutschland 83 was being shown in the UK, and that kind of sparked my interest as well. And I thought, I think this could be a really, really great topic.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. So I'm looking forward to talking about this. So in 1983, or the start of 1983, what was the US perspective on foreign policy re the Soviet Union?
You have Reagan, who comes in, who assumes the presidency in 1981. He takes over from Carter. And so you have the period of really what's often called the Second Cold War, the heating up of the Cold War again. And so you have the period in the 1970s where you had a period of detente, a sort of thawing of US-Soviet tensions, that kind of melted away by the kind of late 70s, early 80s, and that had really kind of given way to sort of the resumption of old hostilities when Reagan became president. And he began to pursue, a very big military build-up, which was the greatest in peacetime. And so Reagan comes in. Carter was seen by some, particularly conservatives in the US, as being quite weak, especially as regards foreign policy. And so Reagan comes in, promises a sort of a peace through strength was his strategy of winning the Cold War, and Reagan really promises to actively roll back communism worldwide, really, especially in places like Central America, rather than just sort of contain it. And so you have a heating up. It's really sparked a heating up of tensions again with the Soviet Union.
Okay, and this is 79. Is it 79 or 80 that the Soviets invade Afghanistan? I think it's 79.
Yeah, that was in 79.
Yeah. So
I mean, actually.
Go on.
Yes. No. I was going to say, I think I think it's often perceived at Reagan that it kind of it all started with Reagan, really. But that's actually wrong, because actually the kind of it kind of started with Carter, actually, because under Carter towards 79, they started kind of psyop operations against the Soviet Union. So I think definitely Reagan comes in and it escalates. But really, I don't think it really started with him.
Because, I mean, the Americans were arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan at this point as well, weren't they?
That's right, yeah.
Right, okay. And so why did the Soviets think that NATO was going to attack them first? Because this is the fundamental reason behind this war scare, is that the Soviet Union believed that America's going to launch a first strike.
I think there are really two facets to why the Russians thought that the West was planning to attack them. I think you have reasons that are specific to the Able Archer exercise itself, but then you also have the broader reasons, the kind of broader backdrop in which the exercise was taking place. So as regards Able Archer 83 specifically, it was an annual exercise, and it seems that in previous years the exercise hadn't sparked these concerns before, but in 1983 there were significant changes to the exercise, features that occurred that hadn't happened before, and it's thought that this is what really kind of caused the Soviets to think that the US might be kind of plotting an attack against them. Particularly, so Able Archer was actually part of a wider sort of umbrella of exercises called Autumn Forge 83, and it was like the conclusion, it was the concluding exercise. And the exercise that was sort of immediately before that happened in September of 1983 was called Reforger 83. And that involved an airlift of 19,000 soldiers to Europe. And so this airlift took place in complete radio silence. And it's thought that this could have spooked the Soviets because, according to their own military doctrine, this was one of their indicators that the enemy, i.e. the West, could be preparing for war. And we'll get into Operation Ryan later on, but that was one of the Operation Ryan indicators. But also there were other features that involved when there was a shifting of command from the permanent war headquarters to alternate war headquarters. And there was also the practice of new nuclear weapons release procedures. And so when they were talking about this, when they were communicating about this, the sort of B-52 sorties were referred to as nuclear strikes. And so there's actually been a US Air Force report that's been declassified recently, which says that this could have caused some misunderstanding if a hostile country was listening in. And we know that the Soviets were, because they were actually monitoring the exercise. Another feature, which the US report that was released a few years ago says that could have provoked Soviet kind of concerns, was that the US Air Force during Able Archer 83, and I'm quoting here, actually practiced the nuclear warhead handling procedures, including taxiing out of hangars carrying realistic-looking dummy warheads. So these were all kind of aspects that really kind of triggered concern specifically in 1983.
Okay, and obviously there's a build up to this. There's a background context of this as well, because I understood that the US Navy were probing some of the Soviet bases, certainly around the Sea of Japan, and going to the lengths of, doing practice attack runs on some of these bases to just see what their radar and what the defenses would do.
Yes, I didn't really look into that specifically as part of my dissertation, but yeah, from about 1979 onwards, the US was sort of running PSYOPs, and some of these started under Carter, as I mentioned, but you have also in May 1983, you have the US Pacific Fleet, which was conducting, it was actually the largest exercise since World War II, and that was called Fleet X 83. And so you have all these kind of, that was in the Kamchatka Peninsula.
Right.
So, yeah, and so, these were perceived by the Soviets to be, extremely kind of aggressive. And Seymour Hersh, the American author, has written on that, and he's described it as, I'm quoting here, a flagrant and almost inevitable error triggered by the aggressive fleet exercise and the demand of senior officers for secret maneuvers and surprise activities. So you have that kind of backdrop leading up to Able Archer.
Yeah.
But you also have, I think you also have, like, the more broadly speaking, there were specific changes to the US strategic nuclear doctrine that happened a few years before Able Archer, which I think contributed to the fears. So you have, and I think it's important to mention, because I think when I come across sort of articles in the kind of media about Able Archer, it's not often mentioned, but I think it's really important. you have a presidential directive, PD 59 it's called, which was signed by President Carter on the 25th of July 1980. And so this was actually basically saying that the US believed a nuclear war could be actually winnable. And so the report that was released in 2015 by the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board in the US, they actually state that they think the Soviets had interpreted PD 59, that it was actually preparing, that they think the Soviets had interpreted it as preparing US strategic forces for a preemptive strike. And really they say that it could have exacerbated the Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union, because this was a new nuclear strategy that was really intended to increase the readiness of the US forces to carry out a preemptive strike against the Soviet Union. And this really strongly influenced subsequent war planning in the US.
And this was the time when KAL 007 was shot down as well, the Korean airliner, because wasn't that over Kamchatka that got shot down?
Yeah, I think that was actually so PD 59 was signed in 1980. So the KAL shoot down was actually not that took place in September 83. So it was relatively only a couple of months really before Able Archer, and apparently it strayed into Russian airspace. And I think I've read various kind of theories about why that happened, and I think I've read that it could have been because the navigational equipment was faulty. But yeah, basically the KAL 007 was an airliner that was going from Anchorage in the US to Seoul, but for some reason it deviated from its original route and strayed into Soviet airspace. And the Soviets thought it was a spy plane. And this was really because previously, in the weeks leading up to it, that the US had been conducting kind of operations in that area. So they thought it was another spy plane, basically.
Right.
So the Soviets shoot it down. There are 269 people on board. Everybody is killed. And I think it's really one of the incidents that really does the most to damage US-Soviet relations in that period. President Reagan, really comes out and strongly condemns the attack. He calls it barbaric and a crime against humanity. And I think the Soviets actually denied sort of that they had done this for about 5 days. And then they sort of admitted that they had. But that created a lot of tension.
I think, didn't the US, one of their listening posters recorded the radio traffic between the Soviet fighter pilot and his ground control?
Yes, I think that came out later. On.
Right. Yeah.
But it's interesting because there's a CIA historian called Benjamin Fisher who's written on Able Archer and who's written on incidents like KAL 007, and he says that it touched off a dangerous incident in US-Soviet relations, and I think that really did quite a lot to damage.
Yeah.
Also because the Russians kind of perceived it that Reagan was kind of using this incident as a way to sort of further his defense initiatives at home, because Benjamin Fisher, who's written a report on Able Archer, says that he basically used the incidents to persuade Congress to support his request for increased defense spending. And this kind of ruffled the Russian feathers even more. And it kind of had an overall effect, really, of kind of shutting down any debate that was, in the Soviet Union about about American intentions towards them.
And also Reagan's ratcheting up, he's using this evil empire phraseology as well. Star Wars, was that round about the same time as well?
Yeah, that was announced publicly on the 23rd of March 1983. And that was definitely perceived by the Russians as a very aggressive move by the US. It's interesting because it kind of demonstrates really to what extent there's a great misunderstanding of both sides' intentions, because Reagan thought that was promoting it really as a defensive measure, but that was not how it was perceived by the Russians. They perceived it as an offensive measure, and that it was kind of evidence that the US was really thought that they could win a nuclear strike, that they were perhaps they were planning that. Yeah. But I mean, SDI Star Wars was also highly criticised in the US because it was perceived that it was actually destabilising the mutually assured destruction doctrine. So it was never actually implemented in the end.
Yeah. So in the Soviet Union, Brezhnev dies in 81, is it? 82?
I think. I can't remember. I think Andropov comes in in sort of the autumn of 82.
Yeah, but by the time of Able Archer, he's not a well man.
No, he isn't. He was suffering from kidney disease. So kind of at the height of Able Archer, he was actually in hospital. He was very ill, and there's been speculation that that's actually, that also contributed to the kind of Russian misunderstanding over the incident, because he was not a well man.
Yeah. So the Russians have a operation to, try and find out when a first strike is going to happen, and that operation is called Ryan or Reagan.
Yeah, I believe it's pronounced Ryan. It's spelled Ryan, Ryan, but I believe it's pronounced Reagan. So that was actually a program set up by the Russians, I think in 1981, to basically search for indicators that the West was planning to attack them. So they have all these indicators, but the Russian agents abroad they were called residencies abroad, for example, in London, they were tasked to report back to Moscow these indicators that might indicate whether the West was planning to attack them. So it was launched in May 1981, and I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Russian what RIAN stands for, but basically in English it's nuclear missile attack. So it was actually Brezhnev who was then the Soviet leader and chairman of the KGB, together with Andropov, announced the details of the meeting. So they basically say that the highest priority would be given to collecting information regarding US NATO political and strategic decisions regarding the Warsaw Pact. But I think so often when Operation Ryan is mentioned, it's mentioned that it was a program to search for indications that the West was planning an attack. But I think what's often not mentioned is the fact that it was about that, but it was also about the fact that it had an aspect that was promoting a preemptive strike, so that if they found what they thought were indicators that the West was planning to attack them, that they would launch a preemptive strike. And this is what the US report that was released in 2015 states, that they believe that actually there were indications that the Russians were planning maybe a preemptive strike. Right.
And what were the indicators that Reagan was looking for? I mean, what were their sort of triggers?
Okay, so basically, there were different areas that the agents abroad were kind of tasked to look for. So you had political, economic, military sectors, civil defence. So basically, particularly in the US and the UK, they were tasked with keeping a very close eye on British government institutions. So, for example, they would be tasked to take close note of what was going on government buildings, for example. I mean, some of it sounds quite comical. That they were told to watch for the number of lights in the windows at night, for example, in Whitehall, because if there were a lot of lights on in Whitehall buildings late into the night, that could indicate that there were meetings going on, that they might be planning for a nuclear war. And one of the people that I'll mention it later that speaks in the documentary to do with Able Archer says that they sort of failed to realise that it could actually be because it was the cleaners that were actually working, not that they were in there late at night because they were planning a nuclear attack. Also, they were tasked to monitor the level of blood in blood banks, because they thought that if, for example, there was a sudden stockpiling of blood supplies, that this could indicate that they were preparing that the West was preparing to go to war, basically. But again, there was a misunderstanding also on the part of the Soviets, the fact that in the UK, blood donation is voluntary. So they said that they would, that they were tasked to keep an eye on the price, monitor the prices of blood, but they didn't realise in the UK that blood donation is actually voluntary. It's another example of the fact that they weren't necessarily being very accurate in the intelligence that they were collecting, and that's actually been one of the criticisms, is that, and one of the reasons why the Soviets got it wrong, in that they thought that the US and the West was planning an attack against them, even though they weren't, because Andropov was he's often described as being this paranoid figure, and he was requesting this war intelligence all the time, but without the analysis that went with it. So even if some of the analysts abroad were saying, well, but we don't really think that the West is planning an attack, it seems that it wasn't really being listened to by him and by some of the high-level leadership in the Soviet Union.
Because I was going to ask, I mean, obviously the KGB and the Stasi would have had agents in NATO at probably quite a high level. Did they consider any information from that? I know it's not an area of your expertise, but obviously, there's Rainer Rupp Topaz, who's the Stasi agent, who's quite high up in NATO.
That's right. This has been part of the problem in kind of studying the Able Archer incident, because there hasn't really been that much information available on the Russian side. And that's been a criticism by, there's not really a definitive agreement amongst historians or other researchers that have studied Able Archer as to whether it was, whether the Soviets genuinely thought it was a war scare, or whether it was just propaganda to try and delay the deployment of the Pershing missiles. And that is a good point, actually, that there hasn't been that much information on the Russian side. But we do have some kind of, we haven't really had much access to archival information on the Russian side, but we do have some oral testimonies, and Rainer Rupp has sort of said that, he didn't, that he was a spy. I think for about 25 years he was the spy for East Germany and NATO, and his boss was actually Marcus Wolf, who I'm sure you've heard of.
Oh, well. Absolutely.
Yeah, and so funnily enough, some of apart from Oleg Gordievsky, who was the KGB double agent who was working for MI6, he's kind of considered to be the person that has given most of the information about what was going on in the Soviet Union. Apart from him, some of the other information that has been released is really about Russian intentions is from the East German side. So you have Rainer Rupp, who was a very high-level spy, and he's in some respects he's been a bit cagey about saying exactly what went on. In some, and on the other hand, he said, well, I did warn them, but I think what happened is that even though people like Rainer Rupp might have pass back information to Moscow, saying, I don't think there is, the West isn't planning to attack. But I think there was a disconnect between what analysts were actually saying and what the high level Russian leadership was believing.
Yeah.
And that's part of the problem.
Yeah. So what state of readiness did the Soviets or the Warsaw Pact get to as a result of this belief that, a first strike was going to happen?
Again, we don't really know definitively, because there's been this lack of information. I understand that the Russian archives and the archives of former Warsaw Pact countries are beginning to open up, but we really don't know. I mean, all we know really is that so Able Archer took place on the 7th of November. It started on the 7th of November and it ended on the 11th. We don't really know definitively why the threat kind of faded away, because we just don't have that access on the Russian side. I mean, it's probable that Rainer Rupp passed information and said, it's not an attack, and then maybe eventually it was listened to. We don't really know. I mean, what's actually some new information that came out in 2015 when the US report was released. There was an Air Force, I think he was a colonel, called Leonard Perutz, and he was sort of on the US side in the bunker, and he decided not to raise the US alert level, and the report says that they speculate that he could have actually contributed to the exercise ending peacefully. But again, we still really don't know definitively.
Because even from the US archive, I mean, presumably with Perutz, he was aware that there was an increased level of readiness from the Warsaw Pact side. So there must be, I'm presuming, some record in the US archive of satellite information or other information that shows an unusual level of readiness within the Warsaw Pact.
Yes, I mean, what does come out in the, I should probably explain, the report that was released in 2015 was a report by it's called the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, and they're basically a group of people that are kind of drawn from actually outside government mostly, I think, and to sort of provide an independent oversight of US intelligence activities. And so this report was written under in 1990. It was produced under the George H.W. Bush administration. The report, the 2015 report, it doesn't really, I mean, it says that they speculate basically that his actions in not raising the alert level could have contributed to Able Archer ending peacefully, but they don't really know why. I mean, I know in the UK there are documents that have been released that that say that there were signals intelligence reports suggesting that the Russians had moved to a high level of alert, but unfortunately they're still classified, so we don't have access to that. And again, this is this has been part of the problem with Able Archer, that a lot of information continues to still be withheld, unfortunately.
Even that far back, I mean.
Yes, I mean, even and I know you probably ask about the UK side, but yes, and it's very extremely frustrating for people like me that just want as full a picture as possible. But I think most of the information on the US side has been released. The report that was released in 2015, I think the National Security Archive have been trying to get hold of that for a long time. I think maybe 10 or 12 years, and they finally relented and released it. But there's an equivalent report on the British side, which was produced by the Joint Intelligence Committee, which is part of the Cabinet Office. And despite numerous attempts by researchers to, who have submitted Freedom of Information Act requests, they still refuse to release it. And I think, the reasons they give are basically national security. And, I would question exactly what national security concerns there could still be. I mean, we're coming up to 35 years now.
Yeah.
And it was 35 years in November after the event. For example, in the UK, the intelligence agencies are exempt from the Freedom of Information Act.
I think you've done some research into the involvement of the Thatcher government in Able Archer and the circumstances around it that aren't sort of like commonly known.
Yeah, that's actually really, really interesting because, I think that is an aspect of Able Archer that isn't so well known. So we don't have access to I think it's sort of the main report on the British side, which was produced by the Joint Intelligence Committee, because that's still withheld. But somebody managed to get released, it's about 10 documents, mainly Ministry of Defence documents in 2013 that were released under the Freedom of Information Act request. And they really show, which hasn't really been known before, the involvement of the Thatcher administration. So they were really involved in the aftermath of Able Archer, basically in advising the Reagan administration about what had nearly just happened. Because I think Reagan grasped the seriousness of what had happened, but it seems that the intelligence agencies didn't. Because you have national intelligence estimates that from 1980, I believe it's early 1984, which were saying that they didn't really believe that the Soviets believed that there was a genuine threat, and they seemed to view that it was really Russian propaganda. They didn't take it seriously. And so you have the British report, which the one that we don't have access to, that was actually written before the US report. So the US report was produced in 1990. We have the UK report, which was produced in June 1984. But these other documents that we do have access to, they were produced in March to sort of April 1984. And it really shows that the Thatcher government were really involved in trying to both persuade the Reagan administration to tone down its rhetoric and sort of change its position on the Soviet Union, and warn them via the information that they received from Oleg Gordievsky to say, basically, do you realize what nearly just happened? That the Russians thought that that the West was seriously planning to attack them. But also there's discussion about ways in which they might prevent such misunderstandings with the Soviets in the future. It's really interesting. There's a lot that's still redacted from the documents, and it's quite frustrating because you'll come across a line where it says, it might relate to Margaret Thatcher or her opinion, and you get to it, and those few lines are sort of blanked out. But although we don't have actual access to the UK report, those documents sort of indicate and suggest that also on the British side, they sort of were coming to the conclusion that they did think that it could have been a serious incident, and that it wasn't just Russian propaganda. But it's also interesting because not only were there tensions between the US and the Soviet Union in 1983, there were also some sort of tensions between the UK and the US, and between Thatcher and Reagan. And I think often it's seen that the Thatcher-Reagan relationship, they got on very well and they were always in agreement over everything. And that's not actually true. They had quite differing positions and opinions on certain issues, particularly over nuclear weapons. Reagan, and it's surprising to a lot of people that perhaps haven't studied Reagan, because he presided over this huge military build-up when he assumed the presidency, that he was actually a nuclear abolitionist. He didn't personally believe in the mutually assured destruction doctrine, whereas Thatcher actually did believe in it, did believe in deterrence, and she actually believed that it provided a level of stability. So they had those different positions. But also, again, in the run-up to Able Archer, you have the kind of special relationship was sort of strained by the time Able Archer happened. So you have obviously the Falklands War the year before in '82, and Reagan, did not, and the Americans did not come out and publicly support Thatcher's position on that. But then you also had the US invasion of Grenada a few months before Able Archer, and Thatcher was really annoyed by that because Reagan didn't consult her. So there were also some tensions to do with that. Although ultimately the UK and the US, despite whatever differences there might exist between the actual leaders at the time, they kind of have to work together, and that's partly to do with all the intelligence sharing agreements that have been in place since the end of the Second World War. But yeah, so it's interesting because in the US, the British opinions about Able Archer were actually viewed with some skepticism by some members of the US government. Some members of the State Department were kind of suspicious because, and I'm quoting here from a document, they say that there was a position subscribed to by some in the US government that the British Foreign Office was simply capitalising on a good political occasion to force President Reagan to tone down his rhetoric and delay deployments of the INF missiles. These documents discuss the fact that the British particularly still believed that these exercises were important, and that they didn't believe, despite what they thought had happened in Able Archer, that they didn't recommend that these exercises be abolished, but that instead they were discussing ways in which they could perhaps warn the Soviets, perhaps in advance of these exercises taking place, so that it would perhaps demonstrate to them that these particular exercises kind of took place, outside of the scope of any particular misunderstandings that might have occurred between particular leaders, Soviet or US leaders.
No, I was going to say, I mean, it's interesting you talking about Reagan as a nuclear abolitionist, because, as you say, he's not necessarily thought of that way. I mean, I remember the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament posters depicting him as a real warmonger. But I guess this realization that they almost went to war with the Soviet Union is directly puts him on the road to Reykjavik and his meeting with Gorbachev and the INF Treaty.
Yes, that's right. I mean, again, there's kind of some sort of disagreement between historians as to whether he was already on that road anyway, before Able Archer came along, or whether it caused a complete shift. There's a really interesting book called Reagan Reversal by somebody called Beth Fisher, and she sort of argues that it really caused a complete turnaround in Reagan's foreign policy towards the Soviet Union. I would kind of not go that far. I think it definitely brought home to him the danger of nuclear war. But I think if you sort of read some of the memoirs or what people said, former members of his administration, they sort of say Reagan was kind of going that way anyway. Perhaps the Able Archer thing brought it home and sped up the process more quickly, but it definitely had a very serious impact on him. And if you read in his diary, he sort of, although he doesn't, I believe he doesn't ever mention Able Archer by name, and that could be due to reasons of secrecy and security, but I believe that was what he was referring to. He says that, did the Russians really think that we were planning to attack them? Because that wasn't our intention. And he does seem genuinely shocked. I'd also say, I think, there's always been a perception of Reagan. I mean, I remember growing up, the spitting image that was very popular at the time, and Reagan was always portrayed as sort of a bit of a dunce, really, and sort of this good-looking actor that was actually quite sick, didn't really know anything. And I actually think that's not true. I think he was much cleverer than people give him credit to, particularly on the nuclear issue. I think he grasped the seriousness of what had nearly happened with Able Archer, before the intelligence agencies did. The intelligence agencies were really very highly criticized in the US report for completely misreading the situation, misreading the Soviets' intention. I think Reagan grasped it. Much immediately.
It's amazing the number of times you hear that phrase where the intelligence services have misinterpreted or misread the situation. I mean, you can,
well, I mean,
Iraq war and weapons of mass destruction. Is there, I mean, aside from the areas that you've covered, is there any other area of Able Archer and the war scare that you think that people aren't aware of, or anything that's really surprised you in your research?
I think really before I studied the Able Archer incident, I hadn't really studied Reagan. Particularly, I kind of focused more on the earlier Cold War and the Kennedy administration, and always found that kind of fascinating. And yeah, I was kind of surprised, about the fact that Reagan was, actually not in favour of nuclear weapons, and that did surprise me, because that's not initially the perception that comes across of him. And I think after studying Able Archer, I sort of come out with a slightly more favourable impression of him. I mean, I know there are things that happened under his watch as president, which I don't agree with. I mean, you have the whole Iran-Contra affair. I think he was, I think ultimately he was instrumental, and he was important in the whole relationship with the Soviet Union, the move towards detente. I really think he was.
No, that's really interesting. Well, that's all my questions I had on Able Archer. But what I tend to do with my guests is I have a bit of a quick fire round. And the first question I've got on my list is, what is your favourite Cold War themed or Cold War era film?
Oh, that's really difficult to pick just one.
You can name. Okay, you can have more than one.
Can I name a few? Okay.
You can go on. It's not a hard rule.
Okay, the one that sprung to mind, and it's probably because it's something that I remember from my childhood, is I'm a huge James Bond fan, and I think that might be partly due to my father, who was a huge fan of sort of the English spy kind of novels and that whole, and he was not he was actually originally from Pakistan, and he sort of emigrated to the UK as a young man, and he then became a British citizen. But he was always fascinated with the sort of British Cold War, British spying novels. So he would always have something on. There was always be a James Bond film on the television. So I loved View to a Kill. It's one of my favourite films. I think it's actually quite underrated in terms of Bond films.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether you listen to the Spybury podcast.
Yes, I do.
But I think a couple of people have rated View to a Kill.
Yeah, but also the other one that I liked, I remember again sort of watching growing up, is War Games. The original one with
Matthew Broderick one.
That's right. I couldn't bring myself to watch the remake.
I didn't know they'd done a remake, to be honest.
Apparently they did. I think it was last year or a couple of years ago. And I'm really kind of against this. It seems to be a trend, a sort of a Hollywood trend lately, that they'll remake, great classics, which I don't think it's that old, and they'll just remake it. And I think that's a really good film. And the weird thing, the kind of spooky thing about that is that Matthew Broderick plays his character. He's sort of a genius whiz kid with computers, and he manages to hack into the sort of the kind of war kind of game nuclear command system in the US, and triggers like this potential countdown. And that was released, I believe it was released in the summer of 1983. So it was actually only a few months before Able Archer, but in some ways it kind of mirrored what actually happened, particularly the Petrov incident, which happened in September, where, there was a false alert that the computers on the Soviet side were saying that the US had launched missiles towards them.
Yeah.
It's quite spooky when you think about it.
Yeah, that is. And what was your third one that you had in mind?
The other Bond film I like is Moonraker. And I particularly remember I think it's the opening scene where you have that the chase in the gondola in Venice.
Yeah.
I don't remember that, and I find that quite funny.
Yeah, no, I remember that one.
Because my mother's Italian, I'm half Italian, so that kind of made me laugh. But I think that's brilliant. I think the way that scene is put together and the way it's shot and the stunts, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And if you were making a film about the Cold War, what piece of music would you have for the soundtrack? Again,
I think I would have to say, I think the theme to View to a Kill, if you remember that, by Duran Duran.
Yeah. Sadly, I remember Duran Duran.
I think that's. I was very young, but I was a huge Duran Duran fan, and I was sort of had a huge crush on Roger Taylor and his lovely long hair. I remember. But
I don't think you were alone there.
I remember this weird situation at my primary school where you were either, there was this kind of pop group rivalry, so you were either like a Duran Duran fan or you were a Wham fan. And for some reason, I went to an all-girls school. You weren't allowed to be both, so we would kind of stare at each other across the playground, But
that's a whole different Cold War you're talking about there.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. The cultural Cold War. I don't know. But also whenever I hear it, it just really transports me back to that period. Is Two Tribes by Frankie Goes to Hollywood.
Yes, yeah.
And you have the opening you have that nuclear warning attack. Kind of I don't know where they got that from, but that's sort of pasted onto the beginning, and I really remember that.
Well, it's that actor Patrick Allen who voiced all the public information films they were going to put out in the event of nuclear war being imminent.
Oh, right, okay. I didn't know.
You can find them on YouTube, actually. They are very eerie. The video of Two Tribes is very good as well, because you've got this lookalike Reagan and lookalike Chernenko having a wrestling match. Yes,
I think that's also fantastic as well. And I think Frankie Goes to Hollywood were all of their videos I think were always really excellent and really on target, and really spoke to the political situation at the time.
Yeah. So I think I'm probably going to know or part of the answer to this, but you might surprise me. If you could invite three personalities from the Cold War period to have a few drinks with, who would they be, and what questions would you ask?
Okay, so I would probably have to say JFK and RFK first off.
Okay.
I'd always been, quite an admirer of them, and the fact that I think, they came from a very privileged, well-off background, but they didn't really have to go into politics. They could have sat at home and just done nothing all day, really. But I think really they were very passionate about trying to improve the conditions in the US for even the very poor. And I think particularly, we've just had the 50th anniversary of the Robert Kennedy assassination. And I always remember that speech that I think is quite remarkable. I think it's probably my favourite speech of a politician. The speech he gives when Martin Luther King is assassinated. And he gives this talk saying that he really, that he knows basically what it's like to have somebody killed, and that he had a member of his family killed also by a white man. I'm not going to get into that whole
Yeah.
whether that's true or not. But he's basically trying to, he was speaking to a group of African Americans, and and saying that really we shouldn't fall into hate. Kind of repeats that at the speech, just before he's assassinated. And I think I'd asked them, really what their experiences, what it was actually like having to deal with the kind of aggressive military chiefs during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when they really were wanting to go to war and bomb Cuba. I can't imagine what that must have been like, actually. And the other one, my third one, I guess, would be somebody, I don't know if you know of him, but he's called David Atlee Phillips.
No, I don't.
Okay, he was a spy that worked for the CIA, and he was heavily involved in the Bay of Pigs operation, and the previous to that, the coup in Guatemala, and he was one of the CIA's top level so kind of covert action specialists. So he was involved with all this kind of covert action. He rose to become the chief of the Western Hemisphere Division eventually, which I believe is one of the sort of the highest positions in the agency. And so he was actually involved in, some quite aggressive operations, particularly to do with Guatemala. That was a particularly aggressive. He was basically a specialist in propaganda, and I'd like to just get his views on the kind of the inside scoop, whether he actually regretted anything of what he did, because what he was involved in Guatemala really set off kind of decades of civil war in the country, and many people being killed. And I mean, he did write an autobiography sort of in the late 70s, I think, after he retired, but it's kind of more notable for what he doesn't say.
Those biographies tend to be a bit
definitely
like that, don't they? They never tell you what you really want to hear.
Exactly. I think they're very sanitized and putting, obviously they want to be seen in the best light. But he's a very, very interesting character, and also there are allegations, which I won't get into that now, but there are allegations that he was perhaps involved in the JFK assassination. So he's just a very, very interesting figure, generally.
Oh, okay. Now you have surprised me, because I was almost going to put money on you having Thatcher, Reagan, and Antropov, but
oh really? Okay.
But no, those are three very interesting, particularly Atlee Phillips was his name.
That's right. Yeah. David
No, sounds really interesting.
Look him up if you're interested in kind of the whole spy thing. He's a fascinating character. He really is.
He's on my list now. Thank you for that. Are there any books or websites that you'd recommend around Able Archer?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, the kind of the first one I'd recommend immediately, and I think it has the most. It's kind of the definitive source on Able Archer is the collection at the National Security Archive. And I have to give a shout out to Nate Jones, who's he's the director of the FOIA project at the National Security Archive. But really, he's kind of, I call him the guru really of Able Archer, because he's really the one who started it all off and really did a lot of the early original research, and got a lot of the early documents released, and has always pushed, and is still pushing to get more released. And the National Security Archive, they are like a non-profit. They're based at George Washington University in the US, and they do a fantastic job. They were able to obtain all these documents, and they put most of it online for free. And for me, for somebody who's not in the US, it's a fantastic resource. So that's got probably the best collection of. It has all the declassified documents, so it has the US report that I've mentioned. You can download that and read it.
Yeah, because he has a book containing a lot of these documents as well, hasn't he?
That's right. I believe that came out towards the end of 2016. Called Able Archer 83. That's definitely also worth reading. There's also the Wilson Center, which has some really interesting records on East German records. Actually, they don't actually have records on Able Archer because I believe that they haven't actually been released yet. But they have some really interesting records on Operation Ryan and the East German involvement in that. And I can send you the links to all of those.
Yes, very much like to see those. I was going to say, have you read the 2 books that came out this year on Able Archer or on the war scare of '83?
Oh, which ones are those?
Now you're asking. There was 2. There was something like On the Brink, I think one was called.
I believe that's is that the Mark Ambinder?
Could be. There's 2, and I can't remember the.
Oh really. Yes, I think there's one by Taylor. Is it Taylor Downing?
That's the one. Yeah.
Yeah, I have not read it. It's on my list. Right. I believe he was a producer of the documentary, which I think.
Yeah, I think Channel 4 did a documentary.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I haven't.
I've read that one, and
have you?
Thought it is a good general reader into the subject. I think it's very good in terms of describing the circumstances and what went on. But I think if you want more detail, then the Ambinder book is probably the better option.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, they are on my list. There are a few that I've noted down. There's a really good book by somebody called Peter Pry. I don't know if you've heard of him.
No.
But he was a former CIA officer who, at the time, he worked on kind of Soviet affairs and nuclear issues. And he wrote a book called, I thought I'd written it down. I think it's called something like Soviet War Scare. But that's a really great book if you want sort of more of an understanding of like the Soviet thinking and their kind of military strategy generally, sort of since World War II, and the fact that they were basically paranoid about a surprise attack basically since the end of the Second World War, but because of the fact of Operation Barbarossa. And it's really interesting. It's really a great book for kind of understanding their military kind of thinking. There's also a really good book called The Dead Hand by David Hoffman. I don't know if you know that one.
No, you're coming out with a load of extra ones for my reading list now.
Yeah, that's a really great one about the nuclear arms race. And he's a journalist he worked as the Soviet bureau chief in Moscow for the Washington Post in I think it's the mid-90s. That's a really, really good one. And also, I'm going to give a plug, and I'm biased about this one. I'm going to give a plug to one of my professors at UCL, at University College London, for a really great kind of general book on Reagan and his kind of character and how he kind of started out, in his time as an actor. It's called Reagan, American Icon, and it's by Ewan Morgan, who's a professor of American Studies here at UCL. He's one of my professors, and he teaches an excellent course on the US presidency, which I took when I did my master's degree. But that's a really good book if you want to kind of understand Reagan as kind of like the character. And
I think, I mean, speaking to you, I am understanding that the character of Reagan is more nuanced than perhaps I thought it was. So another one for my reading list. Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Are there any films or TV series that you think are a good representation of 1983? I mean, I'm sure you're going to mention Deutschland 83.
Yes, definitely. Yes, I love Deutschland 83, and that was, the fictional one, but it was pretty historically accurate, because I believe the producers of the program, they had sort of historians advising them. So actually, it's pretty accurate, and I believe that the character, I can't remember his name now, but the main character, the young man who's recruited to spy, who's sent to West Germany to spy, is based on Rainer Rupp, is what I believe.
Oh,
elucidate.
really? Oh,
That's
okay.
what I've heard. Yeah, that's excellent. And even though it's kind of in German, and I don't tend to usually like watching things with subtitles, but you sort of forget after a while, actually.
If it's that good, yeah, you do.
Yeah, you sort of did. I'd kind of hoped it would, because I studied German when I was at school, and I did a GCSE, and I wouldn't say I got fluent, but I was quite conversational, and unfortunately, since then I've sort of forgotten. I haven't really used it, and I was hoping I might remember quite some of my German came back a little bit, not that much, but no, that was excellent. In terms of factual programs, there's a really good documentary, the Channel 4 documentary, which you mentioned, called 1983 on the Brink of Apocalypse. I think it's been hard. I don't think it's actually been released on DVD. I think it's online. You could probably get it on YouTube.
Okay.
And that's from 2007. And that's really excellent because it features interviews with some of the people actually involved. So it has Oleg Gordievsky, Robert Gates, and you also have some of the KGB generals speaking on it.
Right.
So,
okay.
And it's great, really, as a kind of an oral history, really, because we don't really have that much access to the Soviet archives, but we have their kind of testimonies, and those generals that they interviewed were saying, yeah, we really did think that the West was planning to attack us. So that's a great one.
Yeah.
There's also a film called The Day After. I don't know if you know that one.
Is that the American drama with Jason Robards?
That's right. Yeah, and that film is actually really important, and it's kind of credited for actually also having a huge impact on Ronald Reagan, because apparently he had a private screening before the public screening, and weirdly enough, the public screening took place on November the 5th, which is 2 days before Able Archer, which is kind of strange.
There's just loads of these coincidences coming in here.
Yeah, it is very, very kind of strange. And it has some quite well-known actors, like you said, Jason Robards, Steve Guttenberg is in it, I believe, as well. And the kind of general story is that the war, the war breaks out. So it actually really mirrors the kind of scenario of Able Archer, that war breaks out between NATO and the Soviet Union, and then after the Soviet Union begin a sort of military build-up in East Germany, and then the situation escalates into a nuclear war, which is actually what happened in the Able Archer kind of simulated scenario.
Scarily prescient, really.
It really is, but for some reason it focuses then specifically on how this kind of affected the town of Lawrence, Kansas in the US. So it's really a great film. And he writes in his diary about this film, and he says that I'm quoting here, he says, "It was very effective and left me greatly depressed." And then he also writes that it changed his mind on the prevailing policy of nuclear war. And apparently the film was also screened for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And, I think it really did have a great impact.
Yeah. So Reagan actually wrote in his diary that film changed his view on nuclear, on the mutually assured destruction concept.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he said that, I think it really brought home to him what could happen. And then when Able Archer nearly happened, and he was warned about that after the event, I think it really, really hit him.
Yeah.
And,
so we've got Jason Robards to thank for the prevention of nuclear war. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of like a sort of urban legend going around that apparently that Reagan apparently sent a telegram to, I think, the director, saying that that his film had such a great effect on him. But then I read that that's actually a myth, and that's not actually true. So I don't know, but actually it also had an impact outside of the US because apparently in 1987 the film was shown on Soviet television as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, during the perestroika reforms.
Yeah. No, I'm really surprised. I mean, hearing that diary entry from Reagan is really interesting.
That really surprised me as well.
Yeah. Where can people find you online?
Okay, I don't have a website, but I am on Twitter. My handle is at Cold War Fran.
Brilliant. That's a great handle. That.
I didn't really know what to call myself, and I thought I like the Cold War. I'm interested in the Cold War, so.
Yeah. Francesca, thank you very much.
No problem. You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed our chat and found the content interesting. I certainly found it very fascinating. There's extra information in the show notes. The show notes can be found at coldwarconversations.com/the-word-episode and the number 19. If you like what you're listening to, then do join our vibrant Facebook group. Just search Cold War Conversations. And please do leave reviews with your podcast provider. Thank you very much for listening and supporting the podcast. It is very much appreciated. Goodbye.
This is the Voice of America, Washington, D.C., signing off.